أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Everyone can hear? I don't know if we give a hands up, thumbs up. We'll get into it inshallah. We're given strict timings, so about 40 minutes. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless this gathering and make us those that can I just learn this knowledge, but make us of those that can implement it. So last week, excellent. Last week, I'm just going to quickly review what we did. Last week, we looked at the first revelation. I think prior to first revelation. Yes, we looked at the first revelation. And that was clear. We spent a bit of time on that. What was that? And then the gradual revelation, how the Quran was revealed gradually, and we looked at the four pillars and why it was revealed gradually as opposed to other books. And we said it's to strengthen the heart of the Prophet ﷺ. We said it makes it easier upon the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims to memorize the Quran. It deals with events as they occur, i.e. as in answering questions, and the gradual phasing out of rulings. And we gave the example of the prohibition of alcohol, subhanAllah, which is a beautiful thing in Islam. As Aisha radiallahu anha said, if it was the first thing to have been ruled out, or was if the Quran just came down and started prohibiting things, then surely people wouldn't have followed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His wisdom, He sent it down in portions to a very special ummah, obviously the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. And like we said in one of the in the complete revelation of the Quran as a whole, and as in portions, the wisdom was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the Mashaykh gave the understanding that He made the Prophet ﷺ like every other prophet, but also distinguished him. So he is the best of prophets, and he is the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. So now this Quran came down. How do we get to the Mus'haf that we have today? This is what we look at. Like we said, it wasn't revealed completely as a book to the Prophet ﷺ, but nowadays we have our Mus'haf. How did we get to that point? So we're on page 24 of your notes, if I'm correct. And we're looking at the writing of the Quran. Was the Quran written down? Was there an emphasis put on its writing? Was it compiled? When was it compiled? And how do we get to what we get to today? It's going to take maybe we're not going to get through all this today. It might take us a couple of lessons, but we're going to look at the phases and how we got to the Mus'haf that we have today, which is an absolute blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we will see. So, how was new revelation placed in the Quran? The Quran is a kitab. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, one of the names is Al-Kitab. So it is a book. But at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was never compiled into an actual book. So we'll get to that, but just keep that in mind. At the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was never compiled into a complete book. But when revelation came down to the Prophet ﷺ, he would write it down. And like we said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already preserved the Quran in the memory of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's preserved. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made mention of this. But when Jibreel came alayhi salam and he would bring down a new revelation to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the Prophet ﷺ would receive this revelation, then he had a number of scribes. There was a handful of more than a handful of scribes. Some of the scholars mention anywhere from 40, 41, 42, 43, up to 43 special Sahabi that they were known to be scribes of the Quran. They were known to be, the Prophet ﷺ would call upon one of them to write down the Quran. I want to zone in on one of them when we get into it, just to look at how special they are. And alhamdulillah, we're all teachers. Just I mean, to say the emphasis that a person of knowledge and a person that could read and write had in the place of Islam, and especially in the eyes of the Prophet ﷺ. So we have the example in our book that on an occasion, and like this is many occasions that occurred like this. So whenever the Prophet ﷺ would receive revelation, he would call one of his scribes. So we have this incident over here. One such example, when the Prophet when the verses came down, not equal are those who believe, not equal are those of the believers who sit at home. Okay, so as soon as this revelation started to come down, the Prophet ﷺ, he called for a special Sahabi who was Zayd bin Thabit. And as soon as Zayd bin Thabit came, he would tell him, write so and so down. Okay? So the ayah, like I said, is لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين غير أولي الضرر والمجاهدون في سبيل الله. So as soon as that came down, the Prophet ﷺ called for Zayd bin Thabit. And he said, Ya Zayd, get your ink, or it would call Zayd and let him know to bring his ink pot and something to write on. And generally, Zayd bin Thabit would say he'd find whatever he could write on. So back then, again, something very simple that we have and something that we take for granted is having pieces of paper. And we have them everywhere. We're having the book in front of us, or wherever we are, we have paper and we have access to writing materials. They didn't really have that in the past. So there were specific people that had that. And remember, we're dealing with a majority illiterate community. But there was obviously still the elite amongst them, or the special amongst them that could read and write, Zayd bin Thabit being one of them. So he would then get the things that he needed to write, and he would write it down. But he would also, the Prophet ﷺ would also instruct them, not just to write down the verses, he would also instruct them at that time where that verse needed to go. Or where it was placed. Okay? There is difference of opinion coming later, but the Quran, or the ulama will say that the Quran is tawqifi. So the structure of the Quran is that's intended by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The structure of the Quran is intended by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Sahaba, there is a difference of opinion, but majority opinion is, or the most correct opinion, is that the structure and the ayat of the Quran as we have them, that is the Quran. That's the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for us to have it. So who's Zayd bin Thabit? Who is Zayd bin Thabit? Again, like I said, there is many writers of the Quran, and there was many scribes of the Quran. But Zayd bin Thabit, Zayd bin Thabit comes up a lot. I'm going to look at him when we look at the compilation of the Quran. So Zayd bin Thabit was an Ansari. He was a young boy, and he was an orphan. So his father had passed away at a very young age. He passed away in one of the battles in Medina before Islam. So he passed away. His father passed away, and he was left with his mother. His mother obviously had mothers had great aspirations for him, but he could read and write. He had special qualities, as many others didn't. He could read and write. So when the Prophet ﷺ, because you got to keep in mind, the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina after a bit of time, so they'd already accepted Islam, a lot of people in Medina. So by the time Zayd bin Thabit, at the age of 11, or just thereabouts, had met the Prophet ﷺ, they took him, the people. So the mother of the Zayd bin Thabit said to the men, they went to visit the Prophet ﷺ for the first time when he had came, she said to him, take and introduce my son. Obviously, she wanted great things for her son. And they said by the time for the first time he'd went and visited the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he'd already had 17 chapters. They had pride in him. They said, look at this young boy, his name is Zayd. He'd already had 17 chapters of the Quran memorized. The Prophet ﷺ was very impressed with him. He was so impressed with him that he actually gave him a task, and he said, you know what, I'm going to have correspondence. We have to build these relations with the Jewish tribes. He said, so I need somebody to actually be, make sure the right things are being written down. If they send a message, we're not, the messages aren't getting misunderstood. So he gave him the task of learning the language of the Jews. And they said within half a month, he had mastered their language. Within half a month, radiallahu anhu, he was that bright of a human being, radiallahu anhu. And then as we're going to see, he was actually tasked by Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Umar radiallahu anhu to actually be the compiler of the Quran in its written form. He was obviously special in the eyes of all the Sahaba. And in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, he was given the post of judiciary of the chief authority of the juries in Medina. He lived to about 56 years old, and he died in the year 45 after Hijrah. And so there's two quotes from some of the notable Sahabi. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, when he passed away, or when Zayd bin Thabit passed away, he said, today the learned man of the Ummah has passed. And Abdullah bin Umar also said about him, he said, the people's scholar has died today. So he had a great standing in the eyes of the Sahaba, obviously in the eyes of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. So he would write it down. At the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what was the Quran written on? Like it's mentioned, they would find anything. They would find anything. Maybe it was a backbone, like the scapula, which is a flat piece of bone. Maybe it was date palms. It was anything they could write something on it, and any ink they could get. This was all, each Sahaba that received it or wrote it down would they'd keep it, or the Prophet they would keep it with them, but they would have access to it. Okay, and the Prophet ﷺ would have access to it, and whoever needed it would have access to it, but they did not have paper. And at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, keep this in mind, the Quran was never put into a complete, in a written form, put into a book. Okay, but in what form was it a kitab? It was in the memories of the people. It was in the memories of the Sahaba, and that it was kept in the structure that it's in. Tamam? Excellent. So now we're looking at the last revelation. So the last revelation to come down was, we looked at the first revelation. Now opposed to it, we're going to look at the last revelation. The last revelation that we have here, which is the most correct opinion and is the correct opinion of the last revelation. You will hear many other ones which I'll discuss, but the last one is وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ, which is in Surah Al-Baqarah 281. This is the last revelation of Quran. And again, it just highlights the importance of Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned in many great ways. This is the most correct opinion, and a lot of the obviously the Sahaba lean towards, and the scholars lean towards it, because it came from Abdullah ibn Abbas, who was one of also a young great scholar at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and also afterwards. So this is the most correct opinion. Why do I say this? It is the last revelation. However, there is other narrations that indicate that there was other last revelations. A common misunderstanding, or I'm going to look at two. A common misunderstanding is the verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ. Why is that one? So that, again, there's narrations that say that was the last revelation. Why do we say, well, it was the last revelation. It was the last revelation when it came to ruling. So it wasn't the last revelation of the Quran, but it was the last revelation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, today I've completed your deen, which sounds logical. Or that if Allah saying if he's completed his deen, That's why a lot of, I guess, common people will get mistaken and get lost and say, well, that must have been the last, revelation. Whereas no, it wasn't the last revelation, but it was the last revelation in relation to the orders or the rules and laws of the deen. Another narration comes that says Surah An-Nasr was the last revelation. And then how do we reconcile that one also? We said that was the last complete surah revealed. You know that Surah An-Nasr came down at the time of Al-Hajj al-Wada'. So that's how we reconcile that. And you'll hear other if you ever come across other ones that would say certain ayat, other last revelation. Generally, they'll all have a reconciliation in the sense of it might be the last revelation in regards to alcohol. It might be the last revelation in regards to riba. It might be the last in regards to, or whatever it is. So that it's a last revelation in relation to something. But the last revelation of the Quran is the one that we mentioned and the one that we have in our notes, which is also very befitting, subhanAllah. It was said that the Prophet ﷺ lived for 9 days after this revelation. So after this revelation, the Prophet ﷺ lived for 9 days, which is in At-Tibyan fi Uloom al-Quran, but As-Sabuni, which we have the reference there. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, so revising the Quran, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave, and we said Allah's preserved the Quran in the memory of the Prophet ﷺ. But it was constantly reviewed. It was constantly reviewed between the Prophet ﷺ and Jibreel alayhi salam. The Quran was constantly reviewed in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And as we have in our reference, the last year before the Prophet ﷺ had passed away, so in Ramadan, so the Prophet ﷺ would receive revelation, which we learned about from Jibreel alayhi salam. And as he received revelation, it gets stuck in his memory, and other Sahaba around him would memorize it right away, and it get written down. But every year in Ramadan, Jibreel alayhi salam would come to the Prophet ﷺ and revise him and let him and remind him where each ayah goes. Okay, if that revelation came down, that's in Surah Baqarah in this place. Surah Baqarah comes after this. So that's like we said. That's why we know the Quran in its form is tawfiqiyya. It's complete from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The last year of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Jibreel alayhi salam came down to him and he revised the Quran twice with him. And as he mentions to Aisha radiallahu anha, he says, indeed, Jibreel comes down to me every year in Ramadan and we revise the Quran, and this year he's revised it with me twice, alayhi salam. And I feel this will be the end of all my death will be approaching. And as the Prophet ﷺ knew, it was not long after that he passed away. So the Quran in the time of the Prophet ﷺ was revised. And it was put in. So whenever a new revelation came, like we said, whether it was Zayd bin Thabit or one of the other Sahaba that was ascribed, they would write it down. The Prophet ﷺ would let them know exactly where to place it. Excellent. And the last recital between the Prophet ﷺ and Jibreel alayhi salam was the complete Quran. So in its complete structure, in its complete format. So there's no dispute about that. Excellent. So page 28, we have gathering of the Quran. Forgive me, I'm going through this. Obviously, we're very limited on time. I just want to know if anyone does have any questions about what we're going to cover. If you can send them through, and then maybe if Luway, you can just grab those questions and we can put them somewhere and then we can address them at the beginning of the next lesson. That would be, I guess, the best way to go about it, so we don't get too distracted and answer questions on the spot. Maybe if I finish 5 minutes early, I can try to address a couple. The gathering of the Quran happened in three phases. The 3 phases are in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, like we just mentioned. It was completely gathered in the time of the Prophet ﷺ in a form. Then it was compiled again in a written form in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and then it was again rewritten or redone in the time of Uthman. That does not change anything in the Quran. When we say, oh, why did it have to be rewritten? nothing changed. It was just to make it more accessible and to avoid certain confusions, which we'll learn as time goes or when we get to this. So how was the Quran preserved during the life of the Prophet? We covered most of it. But like we said, the Prophet, it was imprinted in the memory of the Prophet and those scribes. There were so many hafadh amongst the Sahaba. So many hafadh. And it was when certain incidents happened that not every Sahaba was a Hafiz, but a vast majority of them were. And a lot of them were, and they memorized the Quran. And some had more knowledge than others. And the Prophet ﷺ obviously had a lot of, they memorized the Quran, and we all know the status of one that memorizes the Quran. But it was, and how do we know so many of them were hafadh? Like we used that, there was a narration where there was a battle, and actually the well of Ma'un, which was a tragedy where there's so many Sahaba were told to go to a certain place. The Prophet ﷺ had assurance that nothing would go wrong, and a lot of them were slaughtered. And it was told so many of our hafadh got slaughtered. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ, as we know, when people wanted to learn from a certain tribe, then the Prophet ﷺ would send the most appropriate person. So there was a new tribe, and they wanted to learn Quran, which obviously is the main thing. And then there was an ambush or whatever the situation was, and a lot of them got killed. So that's how the narration comes that a lot of the Haffaz were killed. So we know there was Haffaz amongst the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum. We can ask the question, like we said, so by the time the Prophet ﷺ passed away, there wasn't the Quran in a complete book form. So we can ask the question, why? And you think, why wouldn't it have been put in a book form in the time of the Prophet ﷺ? There's a few reasons. I'll indicate towards, but the majority the most common thing is there was constant ayat that were coming down and being abrogated, which we'll look at, which is called nasikh. So some ayat came down and that were needed for a specific time in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then they were removed. So if they were constantly going to write them down at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and new revelation was always coming in, then it'd be very confusing if we had, for instance, a Quran at the time of the Prophet ﷺ that had verses in it, and one Sahabi maybe kept it. For instance, it came down, a revelation came down, and the Prophet ﷺ removed it. Maybe that Sahaba didn't hear about its removal, and he's got it in his kitab, and then that kitab stays alive, and then it becomes contradictory. So it just exists, doesn't it exist? 1, 2, 3, 4, and things like that. So it wasn't written it was actually more of a preservation of the complete Quran for it not to be written. And also we need to keep in mind that the Arabs had their treasure was their memory. That was their treasure, their poetry, their language, their memory. That was their treasure. That's what they were known for. The Romans and the Persians had their things that they were known for at that time. The Arabs, the thing that they had, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them the miracle of the Quran, the thing they had was their language. And part of that language was their memory. Okay, even one instance where Taqi Uthmani mentions in his book, he mentions one story where he mentions about one of the Sahaba at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. At this time, he wasn't even a Sahabi, he was 7 years old, and his name was Amir ibn Salama. And Amir ibn Salama, he lived near a well. He lived near like a well or like a spring. And he lived on the banks of it, and so many travelers would go past there and they'd spend the day there. And the Sahaba, when they'd hear new revelation, they'd share it with each other. So a lot of Muslims would pass by here and recite the Quran. They said him not even just trying to memorize it, but their memory was that great that just sitting down and listening to these travelers go back and forth, he'd memorized a great portion of the Quran before he'd become Muslim, just by hearing the Sahaba constantly narrate it as he went past. SubhanAllah. So they had this trait. So their memory didn't fail them. So at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was that many hafadh that it was impossible. But we said, and we're going to look at it now, The Quran, what was and part of the definition of the Quran? It's mutawatir. It is impossible to make up that lie about the Quran in that verse. So every verse of the Quran is mutawatir. So that the way that they had memorized it, it was impossible to come up with a lie about the Quran. So it was, and that was preserved in their memories. Now, if it was preserved in their memories, why would we then turn around and now put it in a book? So what happened at the time? The Prophet ﷺ had passed away, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is now the Khalifa. Again, it hadn't even crossed their minds yet, let us put this into a book. But what had happened, and this is the greatness of these two great men, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Umar radiallahu anhu, one of the first things in Abu Bakr's Khalifa, on the time that he was Khalifa in his reign, was a lot of the Islamic tribes started to leave Islam. Therefore, the Prophet ﷺ is not around. Some of the tribes said, well, we don't want to pay zakat. Why should we pay zakat to the Prophet ﷺ? Why should we pay zakat to you? And so on and so forth. So a lot of his time was spent in the wars of Ridda. So one of these massive battles was, and we've all heard about the battle of Yamama, which was against Musaylim al-Kadhdhab, who was a man at the time of that came after the Prophet ﷺ and claimed to be a prophet, and come up with verses and say, look, I can write just as good as what the Quran is, and things like that. So Abu Bakr, one of his first tasks was, how do we get rid of this fitna? But obviously, there was a lot of battles at that time. And one of the incidences was that, obviously, they went to battle, and over 1,200 Sahaba had passed away. And of them, there were 70 memorizers of the Quran. So 70 Haffaz. So this made Umar radiallahu anhu very, very worried. So we came to, and you have this all in front of you, and I'm just going to go through it quickly in my words. So forgive me if I make any mistakes in it. But he said, Umar came to the Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and he said, we just lost 70 Haffaz. I think we should put the Quran in a book form. Otherwise, it's going to get lost. If we keep losing Haffaz, how are we going to preserve the Quran? And Abu Bakr, and look at him, subhanAllah, you'd think it's a logical thing, isn't it? But Abu Bakr's first reaction was, how can I do something that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do? And Umar radiallahu anhu, he kept pushing the idea, until he says, Abu Bakr, then Abu Bakr says, I hesitated at first, and Allah opened up my heart, and I realized the importance in this, and they said, well, okay, now who could we put to task to do this? Abu Bakr is the Khalifa, he's not going to have the time to do this completely. And they came up with a special name, which we already mentioned, which was Zayd bin Thabit. Zayd bin Thabit radiallahu anhu. And they said, let's call for Zayd bin Thabit, and let's put this task towards him. So when they call Zayd, and obviously in the hadith, I'm not going to again go through, but he says, Zayd bin Thabit actually narrates it himself, so you can see the emotional state that he was in when this task was put forward to him. So he says, obviously they called upon me, and he narrates to him, Abu Bakr says, well, Umar came to me and he told me 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So when he put it to me, he goes, I hesitated. He said, how can you do something the Prophet ﷺ never did? He said, and I had the same reaction. He said, they kept pressing me and they kept pushing me until I also agreed with what they wanted to do. And he said, by Allah, and look at subhanAllah, and we need to have a great appreciation for the Sahaba. Sometimes, wallah, we don't appreciate the efforts that they made for us to get the deen that we did. Wallah, we can think, but they lived in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and they had great, great things and great people around them, and the Sahaba around them, and they had the Quran direct. That doesn't take away from the effort they had to make. Wallah, the Sahaba could have been lazy in their effort, but the reason they're Sahaba and the reason we received our deen is, wallah, because they weren't lazy. They actually weren't lazy, and they would think of every single way of how they can preserve this deen, and they would think of every way of how this deen could not only stay preserved in their time, but how it could reach us. And they put effort in, and even if it was so hard for them, they would still find a way to make it possible. Radiyallahu anhum. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, radiyallahu anhum, and we say radiyallahu anhum. So he says, when they put this task and they said, you're in charge of this task of compiling the Quran, he said, it would have been easier for them to ask me to, if they asked me to remove or move a mountain from its spot. They knew the weight of the Quran, and they knew how heavy the Quran was, and they knew the responsibility of Quran, and they knew the responsibility of preserving this Quran. Allah, they had this complete understanding, and he said it's such a heavy task that now I'm responsible for the words of Allah. He said, ask me to remove a mountain, and I would have found it would have been easier on me. Radiallahu anhu. So he says, now he ended up accepting it. I don't think he had much of a choice, but they understood it, whether it was a hard task or not, they understood it. And he says, I had to go to the task. One of the, and I wanted to mention this, just goes on Zayd bin Thabit, which like we said, he's an honor to us, radiallahu anhu. And he was selected at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Now Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu again is selecting him. Why was he selected? Ibn Hajar in one of his books, he mentions why Abu Bakr selected him on 4 things, which are the things that can be narrated. These are things that we can try to bring into our lives, especially being teachers of Quran and people that are involved with the Quran. He mentions 4 characteristics that he had. He says the first one, he was young. He was a young Sahabi. He was still a very young Sahabi. And why is this important? Because he's still active. He still has, I can remember. Keep in mind, in this process, Umar radiallahu anhu was also overlooking it. The second one, he was a man of common sense. He was a man of reason. He was a man of wisdom. That if you put something to him, he wouldn't have to think 3, 4, 5 times about it. It's common sense. If something makes sense, it makes sense. You put it towards me, I accept it. And it was clear to him. That was the second one. 3, no one had any accusations on him. He wasn't a person who forgot. No one had ever claimed, but he forgot that once or twice. And he was close to the Prophet ﷺ, like we said. He was a person that was constantly writing the Quran down. And the last one was, he was one of the writers at the Prophet ﷺ. So they're the 4 things. He was young. He was a man of common sense. He understood things. People say, that person, he's a... We can think of people that have these traits. He wasn't accused of any wrong, that he had a bad memory or anything like that. And he was a writer at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And like I said, Umar radiallahu anhu was overlooking the whole thing in that journey. Okay, so now he said, I'm going to look at what you guys had. Okay, so we'll finish this one because we're not going to have time to go into the compilation at the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. So now he was given this task. And as he was given this task, you got to keep in mind, when writing the Quran, they could have just said, for instance, they could have said, we have so many hafad and none of them conflict in the Quran and its structure and its ayat. Why can't we just write down what we know? He was a hafiz. His hafiz was extremely strong. Why couldn't he have just taken so now he's compiling the Quran. He can bring what he has of his writings, and he would have had the majority of it, or of his memory. Whatever he didn't have written down, he can write it down, and no one would have disagreed with him. But they were so cautious in writing the Quran and preserving it so that there could never, ever, ever be a doubt in it. So what were some of the conditions that he put down? First was, you had the person that came had to have memorized the ayat. Obviously, that person is going to come. So they put it out to all the Sahaba and said, we're going to compile the Quran. Zayd bin Thabit is going to be responsible for this. Whoever has seen the Prophet, whoever has received the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ and written it down from the writers or anyone extra, they need to come forward so that we can compile it. Again, the structure is there in their memories. Again, memorize it. Again, there's no conflict, but they needed a solid structure of putting together. The Quran's already mutawatir, and each ayah is already mutawatir, and there's no conflict on it, but now we need to remove the haters or remove any doubt in it. So the condition was that person had to have heard the Prophet ﷺ obviously recite the Quran, receive the Quran. And the other thing was they needed to have the written copy of the Quran, but not just written that okay, Zayd bin Thabit write it down and I'm going to write it down. They had a special condition. The condition was there had to be, when that person had to have written it down in the presence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he had to have a witness that he wrote it down. So it had to be two witnesses of it being written down in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had accepted his writing of it. So he went out, and this task went on for a very, very, very lengthy time. And I'm going to finish with this. That obviously they compiled it, and this was done in open. It wasn't done behind closed doors. It was open. It was an open court, and Sahaba would bring it, and there was thousands of Sahaba witnessing that an ayah would come, and a Sahaba brought it down, and he had it written, and yes, two witnesses brought forward. Yes, I know he wrote it down. No one's conflicting in this. This is one of the miracles of the Quran. No, there's no confliction in it. There's no Sahaba saying, oh, but I disagree with you. No disagreement. But now we're making it solid. He said, I found we had proof for every single ayah, except we came to one. And it wasn't that this ayah of Quran wasn't heard, or it wasn't memorized, or it wasn't imprinted and mutawatir. He said, Sahaba radiallahu anhu, Khuzaymah brought something and he didn't have a witness to it. He didn't have the two witnesses to it. He said, how do we reconcile this? And every other ayah of Quran, we've got it. Until one of the Sahaba came and he narrates a story about Khuzaymah radiallahu anhu. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and we're going to finish with this, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, in this, wallah, this is one of the, we're going to do ijaz of the Quran. Quran is miraculous in so many ways. But this to me, this is another form of its miraculousness and how it's a miracle. There was an instance where the Prophet ﷺ, he borrowed money from a Jewish man, okay, which is fine. When I get to the fiqh of that, you can ask Sheikh Khalid if he's have a question around that. But he borrowed money, and he paid this Jewish man back. But one day, this particular Jewish man, wanted to start a bit of fitna. So he's in the shopping, they're in the marketplace, and this Jewish man comes up to the Prophet ﷺ publicly, trying to humiliate him, as certain people would try to do. And he says to him, you haven't paid me back. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, I have paid you back. You know I've paid you back. So he says, you haven't paid me back. Bring me witnesses that you've paid me back. The Prophet ﷺ didn't have witnesses. He didn't know this man's going to turn around and do that. And this is the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ. He said, I didn't know. So who's standing there in the marketplace where this Jewish man is making accusations of the Prophet ﷺ? A Sahaba named Khuzaymah radiallahu anhu. So as he's hearing this, Khuzaymah comes to the discussion and he says, I'm a witness to the Prophet ﷺ that he paid you back. This Jewish man, being a liar, realized, I've been caught out. And then the Prophet ﷺ, after the Jewish man left, he says, you weren't a witness to it, Ya Khuzaymah. Why did you do that? He said, Ya Rasulullah, we bear witness to your character, and you brought down the Quran, and so forth and so on. And you telling me I can't witness that? If you're telling me you paid this Jewish man back, and forgive me, I'm putting it in my words. I said, you're telling me you paid this Jewish man back, and you think I'm going to let him accuse you of a lie? And he said, the Prophet ﷺ got very happy, and he said, for this, and there was other Sahaba around that witnesses, and he says, for this, your testimony is worth the testimony of two people. So now, subhanAllah, look how now it connects itself. Zayd bin Thabit is sitting down and he's trying to compile the Quran, he's trying to put it down with these proofs, and the one ayah he doesn't have a proof for. The one ayah they have proof, it's memorized, remember. The one ayah they don't have two witnesses for, who had its writing, Khuzaymah radiallahu anhu. So that's one of the beauties of the Quran. And after that, obviously the Quran was put in a written form. And they'd written it, and they put it in a book form, and it was left with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu as a reference point. And the Sahaba still had their memories, and just keep in mind, the Sahaba still had their own copies of the Mushafs. they still had their own written copies. But this copy was now the chief copy. This copy was now the chief copy of the Quran that was left with the custody of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And that was the reference point. Other Sahaba had mushafs, and we're going to learn a bit about those in our coming time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us those of that, like I said, benefit from this knowledge and make us of those that keep this knowledge. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah wa bihamdihi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Please, if you have any questions, send them through about that, and then inshallah, if you can compile them, and then we can go from there. Jazakallah khair.